In October last year, the world witnessed one of the deadliest attacks in Yemen since Saudi Arabia began its bombing campaign 2 years ago. A funeral hall was hit by an airstrike, killing 140 people. The Saudi-led coalition fighting Iran-backed Houthi rebels were already under fire for launching attacks that the UN has called indiscriminate. After the strike, a major arms sale from the UK to Saudi Arabia was halted by the UK's Trade Secretary Liam Fox. But according to the Guardian newspaper, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson wrote to Fox urging him to go ahead with the sale because the UK had received assurances from Saudi Arabia that there was no clear risk. Anti-arms trade campaigners say British-made bombs used in Yemen's war violate international law. They point to a finding last year that connected barrel bombs used by Saudi Arabia in Yemen to a British sale from the 1980s. They've also tried blocking future arms sales to the kingdom in London's High Court, but judges rejected the bid.
I welcome the High Court judgment today. I think this shows that we do in this country, operate one of the most robust export control regimes in the world.
The UK's government is under mounting pressure to reconsider its trade relationship with Saudi Arabia. Since taking office, Prime Minister Theresa May has been strengthening relations with Riyadh and other Gulf countries, hinting at economic benefits for Britain after Brexit. Saudi Arabia is the UK's most important weapons client. Since the country began its campaign in Yemen in March 2015, the UK has licensed £3.3 billion worth of arms to the kingdom, including £2.2 billion in aircraft, helicopters and drones, £1.1 billion in grenades, bombs and missiles, and £430,000 on armored vehicles and tanks. But campaigners say British arms and technical support sold to Saudi Arabia are prolonging the war and suffering on the ground.
Saudi Arabia is a key ally of Britain's, and the Saudi-led coalition has been killing children in Yemen, and we really want that to stop, and we also want it to be investigated where British munitions could be contributing towards some of those deaths.
According to the United Nations, over 10,000 people have been killed in Yemen, most of them civilians. Schools and hospitals have been decimated, exacerbating a new outbreak of cholera. With millions displaced, many are making the case that what's needed now is more aid, not arms. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel. Luke Coffey joins me from Washington, D.C. He was a special advisor to the UK Defence Minister. From London, Andrew Smith, a media coordinator at the Campaign Against Arms Trade. Also in London is Bara Shehban, who is a Yemeni human rights activist and political analyst. Let's start with the Yemeni on the panel. Bara Shehban, is Britain complicit in war crimes?
Thank you. I think, being a Yemeni myself, coming from Yemen and currently living in London, I was able to view the discussion from both sides. So from one side, there is definitely a responsibility on Britain and the United States on how, they need to, of course, reassess where are their weapons being sold to and how are they being used, and if there are any serious breaches of the international humanitarian law, like the situation in Yemen, but also at the other side of the discussion, when most of the Yemeni people don't see that discussion very let's say essential for them. So simply many Yemeni people believe that actually even if Britain pulled out or suspended selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, that does not really affect the conflict inside the country, because simply the conflict started a couple of months before the Saudi-led intervention. So there is definitely some responsibility, but also at the other side, I think we're giving more credit to how much really this is affecting the situation on the ground, or let's say, to be more precise, the conflict the conflict.
Undoubtedly,
precisely.
but billions of dollars worth of arms sales can certainly contribute to a conflict. Luke Coffey, there was this airstrike. 140 people died. They were not fighters. This was a funeral outside of Sana'a. After that, some soul searching in British society. People were unsure about whether they wanted to be complicit in their government selling weapons to the country that did this bombing. Don't you think that if it was left to its own devices and there wasn't the political interference of Boris Johnson, the UK would not be selling weapons to the Saudis?
I don't think that's the case at all. First, I think everyone on the panel agrees that the human suffering that's happening in Yemen is a serious cause for concern. No one would deny or dispute this. But the UK has some of the highest standards on selling defensive weapons, weapons for war, of any country in the world. And this was actually reaffirmed a couple of weeks ago during a case that was actually brought to the High Court by the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, when the High Court ruled that there's no breach of international law, that the UK is maintaining very rigorous and high levels of standards in terms of its defense exports. So I don't think that if there was this so-called public outcry, which actually I didn't see any public outcry.
Okay.
I don't think
well, let me give you BMG research. Okay, allow me to give you BMG research.
But if, I don't even think that there would have been a change in policy.
Just a second, BMG research. 58% of Britain's polled said it's wrong for their country to arm Saudi Arabia. 64% want the government to release a secret report on Saudi's funding of extremism in Britain. Clearly, there's a debate within the country, and the majority of those polled don't like what's going on in Yemen. So that's the justification for saying there's an outcry. Was there no outcry?
Well, that's a poll, not an outrage. And the second poll you mentioned is actually irrelevant to the discussion we're having today about the legitimacy of British defensive weapons.
But that's the country the weapons are being sold to. It's the country the weapons are being sold to.
Well, as I said, Britain has had a long tradition of close military cooperation relations with many countries in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia. There are huge benefits to the British defense industry for Britain's defense exports. And as long as they're done in a legal and responsible way, there's nothing wrong with it.
Okay.
And the High Court ruled a couple of weeks ago that Britain is in fact doing this in a responsible and legal way.
Okay, so let's ask somebody from the group that is unhappy about the High Court's ruling. Andrew Smith, I know you're going to be appealing. What makes you so confident that your appeal will be successful? As Luke said, the High Court ruled and you lost.
Thank you. Well, on paper, UK arms export criteria is very clear. It says that if there is a, quote, clear risk that arms, quote, might be used in a serious violation of international humanitarian law, then an arms sale should not go ahead. Now, Saudi Arabia has been widely accused of some of the most serious violations of international humanitarian law. We are talking about one of the most brutal dictatorships in the entire world, one of the most repressive regimes in the entire world. And it has waged a terrible bombardment which has exacerbated the civil war which is taking place in Yemen and has seen multiple civilian casualties, thousands of people who have been killed. And in fact, the exact episode we're talking about, turning a funeral, a scene of mourning, into a massacre. That is not the actions of a regime that is doing everything it can to avoid civilian casualties.
Luke, are you convinced by any of that?
No. Well, you know, the question is, are these weapons that are being sold being used in an illegal manner? Is it the intent of any country that buys these weapons from the UK to use them in an illegal way, to purposely target civilians or not? And if this is the case, then the defense exports to these countries should stop. And I think the High Court made its point very clear. But in all of this, you know, Andrew takes an ideological point of view against all defense sales, full stop, right? But it completely ignores the benefits of the defense industry to the British economy. Well, almost 300,000 Brits, either directly or indirectly,
we could talk about building the Death Star to create jobs. That doesn't mean it's a good thing, right?
Can I come back
if you're
on this
talking
point
about high-end jobs,
actually?
research and technology, scientific jobs, yeah, it is a good thing, especially if it's done, and only when it's done in a legal and a responsible way, which is the case for the United Kingdom.
Okay. Andrew, you want to come in?
Yeah, I do. On the point about jobs, we've just heard some very misleading stats. According to the ADS group, which is the Aerospace Defence and Security Group, a kind of trade body for arms companies, one which is highly unlikely to understate a number on purpose, they have said that 55,000 jobs in the UK depend on arms exports. That's not 300,000. Now, of that 55,000 figure is actually about 7 years old as well, so we can assume that the number's actually gone down slightly since then. What we're talking about is 0.2% of jobs in the economy. It's not the mass employer, which it's often talked about as. Now, these are some of the most skilled people working in the economy, some of the most skilled engineers. We want to see their skills put to good use. The arms trade relies on a huge amount of support from government, both in terms of political support and financial support. There is a civil service department, the Defence and Security Organisation, which is specifically set up to promote the sale of arms abroad. We want to see this kind of support being put into better, more sustainable industries rather than those which depend on war and conflict in order to make a profit. The UK arms some of the most brutal repressive regimes in the world, taking the civil war and bombing in Yemen. In the period since the bombardment began, the UK has actually licensed over £3.5 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, including fighter jets which are flying and bombs which are being dropped from the sky.
Okay, very briefly, Luke, because I want to broaden it out, but come in, Luke.
Andrew, I don't want to bore the discussion with the facts and figures and the stats, but using 7-year-old figures is a very accurate way to portray the situation. This information I got comes from a King's College report from 2015, and it's indirectly and direct. So those directly supporting the defense industry and all the SMEs and all the other smaller businesses who help with the supply chain, we're talking 300,000 jobs, more than half of which are high-skilled jobs, with a turnover of £22 billion a year.
Okay.
This is a serious industry for the UK.
But can we, for the sake of this
research and technology.
Certainly, for the sake of this discussion, even if it was fantastic for the British economy, that does not make the suffering of the people in Yemen any less real, right? So let me kind of recalibrate this for a second.
You're assuming that the suffering of the people in Yemen is connected directly to British defense sales.
No, what we're talking about is accountability. And that's why we're discussing it. And I tell you, I mean, we're not taking perspectives here. If I had a chance, Luke, if I had the chance to hold to account somebody who was selling billions of dollars worth of weapons to the Houthis, I'd be very happy to put them on the show. This is not taking sides in the Saudi civil war, right? But I want to kind of refocus
you should find an Iranian
in the Yemeni civil war, and the Iranian influence over the Houthis does not compare when it comes to what we're seeing with the backing of the Saudi-led coalition. But if we had the opportunity, and we have done in the past, we've looked at that. But I want to broaden this out again, and I want to focus on the people of Yemen, because I've got some extraordinary stats. 10,000 people killed, or more than 10,000, 3 million displaced, and now we've got the world's worst cholera outbreak in Yemen. Have a look at some of this. Since April, more than 400,000 people have been infected. Among them, about 2,000 people have died, and around half are under the age of 15. Children at the center of this outbreak. Some of these pictures have been very hard to look at as well. Now, I want to ask you, Bara, when you look at this unimaginable suffering of the Yemeni people, and you see that you have UN Security Council members who are backing one side in this conflict, how do you change anything, really? Is there the political will? Because things like cholera are the symptom of the conflict. How do you change anything when there doesn't seem to be the political appetite to bring this to an end?
I think the problem is you don't see actually, and I'm talking again from a Yemeni perspective, you don't see a unified decision when it comes to Yemen. Yemen is usually being debated on the just in the back discussion of Saudi Arabia, and unfortunately most of the people who are involved when they come to the discussion about Yemen are actually interested in Saudi Arabia, not about Yemen. The only solution out of the current conflict is a political solution, and we have said that repeatedly. And the only solution, if I want to be more precise, is for both parties to give a compromise. You have President Hadi and his deputy should hand over in exchange for the leader of the Houthis, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, and the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who's always missing in the discussion, by the way, need to get out of the country. That's the only way that Yemen can get out of this mess. There's also the component of the local councils that haven't been supported by any of the UN agencies. Most of the UN funding is very concentrated at the very central level, and that's another problem. And that's why we have, when you have such an outbreak like cholera, there is a failure to quickly respond and quickly be responsive to the problem. So we're having a failure of a failure, and the international community are still discussing which side should we back. Are we on the side of the Saudis, or are we back of the, or shall we, or are we giving more positive signs to the Iranians? And that's, I think, at the core of the Yemeni problem. Yemen is missing from the discussion. Again, the former president is still in the country. He have continued and participated in the suffering of the Yemeni people, but he's always missing from the discussion. And again, the only solution is a political solution, even if we continue this war, I think, for another year or two.
Yeah, Andrew, isn't this at the heart of your problem? Because you're campaigning against the arms trade, whereas the political calculation that's being made by the UK government is that, yes, we need a political solution, but according to their foreign policy right now, they want one side to win, which is why they're arming one side. They want to restore President Hadi to have control over the whole country, and this is why they believe it's justified in supporting the Saudi-led coalition, selling weapons to them, in order to ensure that Hadi and his Saudi allies and their allies win against the Houthis. That's a political solution. So you're campaigning against a kind of brick wall here, aren't you, Andrew?
Well, we also want to see a political solution, but if the Saudi military solution was one which is going to work, then it would have worked already. For the last 2.5 years, the civil war has been exacerbated, and the bombardment has also played a key role in destroying vital infrastructure, including life-saving infrastructure. Schools and hospitals have been hit as well. Now, obviously, not all the atrocities being committed are being committed by Saudi forces, and that's one reason why it's a very good thing the UK rightly isn't arming the Houthis. But the longer the bombardment goes on for, we don't believe it's going to make a political solution any more viable. But also, at the moment, it's worsening the humanitarian crisis which has been inflicted upon the people of Yemen. And we've seen some horrifying statistics. Ones you read out were horrifying. We saw a report from UNICEF which came out last December saying that a child is dying of preventable causes every 10 minutes. This is the human cost of the war. But it's not just the 10,000 people who've been killed as a direct result of the conflict. And incidentally, that figure is almost a year old as well, as far as I'm aware. It's the people who are dying every day from preventable causes who simply do not need to be dying.
Right. And Luke, I'm happy that you mentioned the High Court ruling earlier on, because it shows that you trust legal ruling vis-a-vis a conflict. If it can be ruled or proved, Luke, that atrocities are being committed by the Saudi-led coalition using British weapons, would you rethink the support of the Saudi-led coalition by the UK government?
Of course. I mean, this should be without, in fact, I've already stated this. Defense exports have to be done in a legal and responsible way. And if it's ever shown a connection between the use of British defense cells to Saudi Arabia used illegally in Yemen, then of course this should be reviewed and probably stopped. But this whole discussion, this whole debate we're having is based on two false assumptions. Firstly, that in fact British defense weapons are being used against as part of atrocities in Yemen, which no link has been made. And the second, that Britain's only selling these weapons to Saudi Arabia because of the war in Yemen. I would say that has a very little, if any, significant part in the decision-making process on why Britain sells these weapons to Saudi Arabia. They sell these weapons to Saudi Arabia as part of a larger geopolitical context in the region for balance of power, considering the role of Iran's nefarious activities in the region, and as also a tool of foreign policy. And defense exports are a legitimate tool of foreign policy. But I'll reiterate, so it's very clear, this has to be done only in a legal and responsible manner. Okay. And so far, that's what the High Court ruled, and that's the case as it stands.
Okay, let me give our Yemeni on the panel, Bara, the final word here. We have less than a minute to go. I want you to wrap us up, Bara.
Yeah, I think quickly to say, I understand where Andrew comes from, and I think that's a very valid point. If I'm a British citizen, that would be very much concerning to see weapons being sold when there is actually an active conflict. My fear is that actually, if actually the Saudi-led coalition did pull out, if actually they even managed to get the UK arms sales from suspending, they might find that actually the conflict is not ending, and actually it is still going on, and then we're going to discuss this again and say, hey, what's happening? What's going on? Unless there is a comprehensive solution that actually ends the conflict, not actually just delays the atrocities, we're going to meet again and again and still discuss about the same things, I'm afraid.
Okay, we covered some important ground, I think. Andrew Smith, Luke Coffey, and Bara Sherban. I really appreciate all of you coming on the program. Thanks so much.